What is up, ladies and gentlemen? Welcome back to the FudgeMuppet Elder Scrolls podcast. I'm Scott, and I'm here with Michael and Drew, and today we are going to be talking all about the dragons and also the dragon cult. So, who wants to get us started with just some, what are dragons, the general gist, without diving into the deepest stuff just yet?
I guess they're one of the most fascinating creatures, if you could call them that, to grace the Elder Scrolls universe, but they're not a creature unless you think Argonian's a creature because it looks like a lizard. They're actually a highly intelligent race of flying, I guess you could call them reptilian, could you?
Yeah, definitely reptilian.
Yeah.
Flying reptilian beasts covered in scales. They have wings, and I just want to clarify because I don't want any comments saying they're wyverns, not dragons.
That's such a stupid comment.
I know.
Because a wyvern is just a type of dragon, and that only really came about a few hundred years ago as well. But yeah, the general idea is, only two legs, that means it's a wyvern.
Yeah.
Generally speaking, yeah, but...
Was that a D&D thing? Or was it...
No, I think it kind of like originated in like the 1800s
But,
as being a designation because it's like used in heraldry. Not so much they have any real folklore, but they're just a type of dragon.
But to me, yeah, if it's in the Elder Scrolls, they say it's a dragon, that's the dragon.
Yeah.
In the same way that in Asian
Exactly.
mythology, that the dragon's like this sort of serpentine, scaled and furred kind of thing, and it doesn't necessarily have wings. So, you know, it's, that's not a dragon, it's a sky snake, like, you know what I mean?
And you actually see a lot of mythology about dragons being very similar to birds of prey as well, because it's like very much rooted in the human idea of being terrified of snakes and birds of prey and things like that. So, you know, it's very adaptable.
Yeah. And
Anyway, so they're big flying creatures, but they're intelligent. They have their own language. There's a lot of mystery, which I guess we'll talk about as to where the dragons originated from. And I guess very interestingly, they seem to have always been. So they've been around forever, seemingly.
Yeah.
And they're immortal. They're immortal.
They kind of like rank up there in that sort of like mythological spirit kind of thing, in the way that they're not like some super organic creature with like you know, a life cycle, and they don't like procreate, you know, through mating and stuff like that. But they have they're also well known for their affinity for magic, and also, you know, the thumb and stuff like that, which we'll get into. But I do like how they sort of explain it. I mean, they just explain it away with magic, but their affinity for magic is what allows them to fly despite their non-aerodynamic frame, and speak despite no lips and stuff like that, which is a cool little add as well.
Yeah. So and it's the magic definitely then in that case, which is something I think a lot of people forget, does go beyond just breathing fire and doing dragon shouts.
Yeah.
I mean, obviously that there's a lot of magical affinity to anyone who can use such elemental magic or slow time or do any of the things that a dragon can do with dragon shouts. It's unrelated, but I do wonder, can they use conventional magic as well? I think they can. There's no reason that they can't.
Yeah, I think I'm pretty sure there's even been things in the lore, but it might be from Daggerfall time, about them enchanting things. And then also, like, there's Durnavir and his study of necromancy and stuff like that. I mean, you're kind of limited if you can only use the thumb necessarily, or maybe not. Maybe it is all through the thumb, but I think there's no limit. Like, there's plenty of creatures that have magical sort of abilities without having opposable thumbs. You don't need to be able to like cast it with just a hand or something like that. And they're obviously very intelligent, immortal creatures. Like, they have all of time to study and learn this kind of stuff. So,
I guess that's as well something that I kind of, in regards to their intelligence, which is a kind of base trait about them, you always hear that they're an intelligent race. I've always pondered, how much are they intelligent due to just being around for thousands and thousands of years? Like, take a man, for example, and have him live for 30,000 years without degrading in any way. He's probably a pretty wise dude, you know?
Yeah, and a lot of their, like, being intelligent comes from just being so powerful that they can kind of subjugate anyone who rivals them as well. You know, so it's when they say, you know, for them power equals truth, and their fights are just massive debates with using the voice. It's like, Imagine trying to say they're wrong about anything.
It'd be like arguing with you.
Yeah, true. Fair.
Except if you breathed fire, then we wouldn't have any debates.
Yeah,
anymore.
you haven't seen my final form yet.
Exactly. There would be no Kine versus Lorcan. It would just be a slaughter.
Yeah, but so we know what they are roughly, right? But where do they come from is the other question. And so we can just sort of start talking about like what lands they're said to come from, because beyond that, if they are these sort of like immortal beings that have just sort of always been, then they kind of just came from nowhere, in the same, like probably in the creation of time. You know what I mean? But let's just talk some geography first. So
Okay.
Atmora and Akavir are the big talking points, but you guys want to...
Well, the thing about Akavir as well is obviously there's a lot of lore, which we'll talk about in a second, about their involvement on Akavir. But one of the main reasons you say, oh, they come from Akavir is because Akavir means Dragonland. But if they're such, like ever-present creatures, you could kind of just get there, see a dragon and be like, oh, this is Dragonland. It doesn't necessarily mean they come from there.
Yeah.
That's true. Well, I mean, there are also in further support of that, the stories about the Saesi trying to, after eating the men, I believe, trying to eat the dragons and them fleeing to Tamriel is kind of like a theory from that. They talk about red dragons and black dragons. And of course, there's Toshraka, which we talked about in the Akavir podcast, who was a Kapotan, I believe, right?
Yeah.
Who basically became a dragon.
And it's very hard to date the stuff that goes on in Akavir as well. So we can't really say, does this predate the stuff that was going on in Atmora, or did it come afterwards,
Yeah, I've also heard theories that the dragons in Akavir might not have been just the same as the dragons we see in Skyrim. They may have just been a completely different type of race that looked like dragons. Perhaps based on the theme of Akavir, they could have looked a bit more oriental and, being the dragons, but that could explain perhaps why the Saesi were able to, I guess you could use the word, defeat them in a sense.
Yeah.
Because dragons are meant to be super, super powerful. And before you interject, I'm not saying I subscribe to this idea. It's just food for thought.
Yeah, I mean, I sort of like the idea, at least in my sort of headcanon, that the Saesi, when they ate all of the men, but then they're trying to eat all the dragons, but they failed. But then they came to Tamriel and they found what they were looking for, aka Riemann, the Dragonborn, a person who would actually be able to be permanently able to like eat the dragons and kill them and so on. And I feel like it's sort of, I kind of get the idea that they are like the same kind of dragons, like perhaps different forms. Like there's nothing stopping them from looking like we've seen serpentine dragons in Skyrim and stuff, and they look quite different to other ones. So there's no reason that the dragons can't look individual and maybe, riff off some of those oriental features. But I still think that in the Elder Scrolls, dragon would be associated with those sort of immortal children of Akatosh type thing.
Although not always. I think it was Daggerfall that had a dragonling type creature.
Yeah, but apparently
that looked like a dragon, but it's actually not.
Yeah.
There's also even imps in the Elder Scrolls Online that can use like an illusion magic spell to look like a kind of small serpentine dragon.
Yeah, but I feel like it's kind of more in the same way that how we have like like a Komodo dragon, you know what I mean? Like those kinds of things. It's not a actual dragon in the way that, you know what I mean?
Mm-hmm. For sure. And then the other theory is that the dragons came from Atmora.
Yes.
Unless you have anything else to say about Akavir.
No. Yeah, so the Atmora, that whole idea is all from the sort of Dragon Wars Skyrim lore that kind of has to place the dragon cult in Skyrim at some point. And like, where did the Nords come from? They came from Atmora. So that's how the dragons would have come with them. Like, there's some sort of finessing to do with the actual timeline there as well. Like, yeah, it's kind of, you can tell that the whole Dragon War thing was inserted later. It wasn't originally in mind. You know what I mean?
And I think the book as well, it talks about, and this is something I find particularly interesting, although we'll try not to get onto the Dragon Wars, Dragon Cult stuff just yet. But I do find it really interesting that it says that obviously the dragons ruled in Atmora, supposedly, according to this text, but basically that there was peace. You know, it talks about, I can find the exact quote. It said, in Atmora, where Ysgramor and his people came from, the dragon priests demanded tribute and set down laws and codes of living that kept peace between dragons and men. In Tamriel, they were not nearly as benevolent. It's unclear if this was due to an ambitious dragon priest or a particular dragon or a series of weak kings. Whatever the cause, the dragon priests began to rule with an iron fist, making virtual slaves of the rest of the population. So it kind of sounds like in Atmora, living under the dragons, if you believe this, I guess, myth, wasn't as bad, especially with them worshipping animal gods and dragons being like the most powerful of all of them.
Yeah. I don't know what you mean. I get the vibe that when Ysgramor first came, he sort of was... maybe the dragon cult wasn't even a thing yet as such, or at the same like power level as such. And then so when Ysgramor came over... He sort of sets up Skyrim and with his 500 companions and Nordic civilization sort of spreads and the Falmer get beat out. But then, maybe a couple of generations in, the dragon cult starts being a thing, but they sort of treat Skyrim as sort of like a wilder frontier, which sort of allows the dragons and the dragon priests to sort of get a firmer grip on it all, as opposed to Atmora, which would have lots of other... political factors and entrenched sort of traditions and such. Kind of get what I mean? I'm pretty sure I can't actually remember the king. Yeah, but what's interesting is King Harold, who is apparently the 13th in line of Ysgramor. Some people debate the Ysgramor line and stuff, but I don't think there's really any reason to. But he was born in the First Era, and his reign starts 143. So this is all post-Dragon War kind of stuff. But he is remembered for being the first king to relinquish all holdings in Atmora and basically making Skyrim an independent, just separate thing from Atmora. So that implies that everything before then, that Atmora and Skyrim were rather connected. Which sort of, to me, I'm like, what does that make the Ysgramor kings in Skyrim before him, if you know what I mean? Like, what does how does that work in with the dragon priests and stuff like that? Because the dragon priests were like these priest kings, and the dragons had power over them, and the priest kings, it's like, where did the traditional sort of monarchy fit in?
I feel like this just wasn't thought about when they were writing the law. is my honest, like, from my heart, that's my answer.
Yeah.
But I like to be like, that's really interesting to think about. And in a way, it is. Because you want to rationalize the law.
Yeah.
No one wants to look at the law and be like, there's the bad writing section.
Yeah, absolutely.
So I'm down for that.
Yeah, because you feel like the dragons would kind of just stomp on Ysgramor and his companions if they started to get a bit too carried away with their power.
Yeah, for sure. And also, beyond just stomping on them, stomping on all over Tamriel. You don't see the same evidence of dragon priests and the dragon cult in the rest of Tamriel. I mean, Scott, did you want to talk a little bit more about where dragons have been in other parts of Tamriel?
Yeah, well, there's the whole... So we know that Skyrim sort of seems to be their... If you're trying to look at it chronologically, like their touch point, like when they sort of first started inhabiting Tamriel in a large capacity, from what I remember. But it's Calgrontid, I think, and his buddy dragons that went down into Elsewhere. And this is all the events of the Elsewhere DLC, and they're trying to like basically get the power of the moons and so on. But they essentially get locked away in this vault by a bunch of heroes. And they get later in the writings, they get called like a demon weapon and stuff. It's sort of forgotten that they're dragons as time goes by. But that's only, so there's dragons in Elsewhere, and that's also in part of their mythology and so on. I can't actually remember how canon this is, that there were, maybe it's a Kirkbride thing or something about dragons in Morrowind and why there's no dragons in Morrowind, but they were driven out by cliff racers. Like if you imagine
Yeah, I've heard that.
cliff racers like these like innumerable thousands of pests that sort of like, do you know what I mean? Like it could be like, it could work.
You'd think they'd just take a big fire breath to the whole flock and just burn them to shreds.
Yeah.
Because that's the other thing I will say, while we're still talking about dragons as a base concept, I suppose, there's this idea that they're actually way more powerful and even way larger in just raw physical size than you see in the game Skyrim. Because obviously in Skyrim, we assume that, you know, there's more population in the cities, Whiterun is bigger than, you know, it actually looks on the fields and so forth. So you can kind of imagine a dragon being as big as Dragon's Reach is meant to be compared to a human. Obviously, we don't upscale the humans, like, oh, all the humans are 10 times bigger. But if we upscaled their city and then imagine a dragon landing on the top and being the same size proportionally.
Yeah.
I mean, look at, I think it's the Legends card for Odoving.
Yeah.
Is this giant dragon, like, wrapped around this, like, burning building.
Yeah, absolutely. But because, yeah, there's concessions that have to be made for gameplay reasons. And also, it would be kind of silly if you're running around Whiterun and the dragon is like to scale like bigger than all of Whiterun kind of thing, you know what I mean? Because it's, you know, rather small in game. But yeah, I guess we could start moving on to actually talking about the deeper meaning of dragons and their relation to time and Akatosh as a god of time, because they're really, really fundamental. Does anyone else want to start on this, or?
I guess a segue is that I could actually talk about which is kind of, again, related to base dragons, but how hard is it to actually kill them? Because like you're about to go into the concept of time and things like that, they're immortal in the sense that their souls can be resurrected by Alduin, but, you know, individuals or big groups of people can still kill them.
Yeah.
It's just very hard. You have to imagine their scales are extremely tough. They're super big. They can do all these different shouts and stuff. Like in Skyrim, they use, one shout at a time. But really, there's no reason they couldn't use slow time and things like that, right?
Yeah, of course.
I mean, their language literally manipulates reality.
Yeah.
So, and yeah, just being ageless and immortal and so powerful. But they can die. What happens when their soul gets absorbed?
Well, here's a little theory. I literally just, I've sort of dabbled in it and thinking about it before, but if you think about the dragons and dragon souls as actual like chunks of time, so like a soul, it's imagine if you had like the concept of time or Akatosh or whatever, and it's like comes down and there's like lots of derivative souls. Some are larger than others, such as Alduin, who's a big, powerful firstborn, because the whole idea, children of Akatosh, it's just sort of like, it can just be like derivative of, if that makes sense. So, but then if you think about one dragon consuming another dragon, it's kind of consuming another like chunk of time, another dragon's soul. So it's all like, you know, a bit like Spore, like, you know, and they're going around in the cell stage and they're just cannibalizing other cells and getting bigger and bigger.
So basically like a matter can't be created or destroyed type thing where you've got time and you can just absorb other dragon souls, but it just...
Yeah, it kind of explains their intelligence as well, because it says they literally, like, when they absorb the souls, they claim their knowledge and their life essence. So, you know, if they're really intelligent, you can have a very powerful dragon who, you know, power equals truth. They consume another soul. They become more intelligent by absorbing all of their, you know, memories or whatever else. And that's how they become such a powerful, intelligent race.
Yeah, you definitely could have that, especially seeing as there's seems to be so many of them, all living for thousands of years, all dying, all being absorbed, and knowledge just being passed around and so on.
So yeah, that's the way I understand it, that it's not... they, even when they're absorbed or whatever and like properly dead, they're not dead. They've sort of just become part of a larger soul. I bet another dragon. You know what I mean?
And in a way, what's the difference then? I know obviously there's the physical difference, but between a dragonborn filled with souls of dragons who can functionally do very much like similar things and a dragon.
I think there is none really, because like we can see that, like, you know, as the Dragonborn, you absorb Mirak, who was another Dragonborn, he's in possession of another dragon soul, and you absorb all of Mirak, and then there's no reason for me to think that then another dragon couldn't kill the Dragonborn and absorb their soul, or just exactly how you do it, vice versa. And that's why it's sort of like, so kind of like only a dragon can properly kill another dragon, because besides the physical manifestation, there's that soul, that chunk of like immortal time kind of thing.
Could that change personalities though?
I was thinking that.
This is a pretty out there theory, but like, how about we just get Alduin to kill Paarthurnax, and then Alduin just permanently chills out from getting all this mad sage knowledge?
Yeah, maybe.
I don't think it works like that.
Yeah,
it's just funny.
There could be interesting elements to play with there, though, for like story potential. But overall, we know that dragons and Dragonborn, by extension, really, I guess, are involved with time, and Akatosh, the god of time, and we can kind of start getting into it. But there's this concept of Akka or Akatusk, another thing, and this is a little bit out there. It's less like canon, but it's the concept of time, where, because there's various interpretations of the different time gods. So there's like Auriel, the elven sort of king of the gods, but he created time. But then there's sort of Akatosh, the dragon god, you know, and then there's Alduin, who's also kind of confusing because it's firstborn of Akatosh, and then other people like, oh, it's an avatar of. But basically this whole, like, this shards of Akka idea is that you have this sort of big oversoul or dragon oversoul concept, and then you have Auriel as personification of the beginning of time, Akatosh as the middle, and then Alduin as the end, like the world eater who will end the cycle. So you sort of have these three elements, because it depends on like how you look at things, because there's evidence to support different theories and stuff, but they're kind of all part of the same entity, in the same way we covered this in the Complete Guide to Gods, but sort of how, you know, Kinnereth and Kine and Kanathi and Tava are all sort of different mythologies imposed on this one central idea of nature, wind, air kind of stuff, but it kind of creates a multiple personality disorder. Like, they're all kind of valid. They're just different mythological lenses to look at that same god. So
have you heard of the concept that this Akka concept, because obviously there's the different entities you could say it's made up as, which are all quite different to one another, right? Like, you have Auriel, who is all super elven and whatnot. Then you have Akatosh, who is like, you know, one of the divines, kind of like created by Alicia, or even spoke to Alicia before being created.
Yeah, it's like the concept of Akatosh comes up first in her stories.
And then the final entity wants to like end the world, for lack of better terms. And then you could almost say Auriel, being an elvish god and being tricked according to elvish legend into kind of creating creating Mundus, is anti-mortality and anti-men, right?
Yeah, the beginning, like...
Yeah, and then Akatosh is pro-men and super benevolent to men.
I kind of see him as like almost like the middle point, you know, because it's kind of like, it's very similar to, you know, Satakal and the Ouroboros. Like, in Christian folklore, they adopted the Ouroboros to be a dragon that's chewing its own tail. Or, you know, you've got Nidhogg in Norse mythology, who chews at the roots of the world tree or whatever. So, you know, Auriel is like, because of the elves, you know, the elves see men as kind of like the downfall into mortality and into permanent death. So it's kind of the evolution from the elven aspect of Akatosh to the very human aspect of it. And then you get that, you know, kind of birth and destruction cycle.
Yeah.
You know, that's
It's pretty cool. There's also the concept that this whole overarching Akka is insane, which I really like. I mean, obviously anything eating itself, you could say, is quite nuts.
Well, I mean, you could go on, like, you know how they go, the definition of insanity is doing the same thing over and over again.
Exactly.
That's the Kelpic cycles. It's go over it again. It ends up eating itself, and then it begins anew, and then it does the same thing over and over.
And there's stories of Akatosh as well, having like, 2 heads, 1 man, 1 dragon. And like, there's even, and Drew, you'll like this, there's a quote from one of the Pelennor books where he actually references Akka. And he says, "O Akka, for our shared madness, I do this. I watch you watching me watching back." So he actually says, "O Akka, for our shared madness." Then there's the whole idea that Pellennor's an Akka avatar.
And it's cool because we just talked about the fact that when dragons eat other dragon souls, they kind of absorb life essence and knowledge. So it's like when the Kalpic cycle starts again, there's kind of like imprints of memories of the past as well that linger. So it's kind of like how the dragons absorb the life essence of the dragon they've just defeated, which in the case of Akatosh is itself.
Yeah, because there's all of these entities that are sort of trans-Kalpic entities where they sort of exist beyond the previous ones, because you sort of still have the same Daedric princes, the same sort of Aedric entities, it seems, as each incarnation of Mundus or whatnot, because there's like Molag Bal being like king of the dregs in a previous Kalpa, or you have references to Divine Father of Umaril from a previous Kalpa, and all that kind of stuff. That it kind of leads into the idea of the cycles, that the Dawn Era is both the beginning of the new, but it's also the craziness of the Dawn Era is actually the end of the previous as well. So that's why you get those pattern elements that carry on over into the next one. And if you go with the idea that the dragons are sort of infinite derivatives or divisions of like Akka or whatever you want to call it, the time god, that they would sort of exist beyond as well, and they would sort of perhaps have gone through many existences, or maybe at least incarnations, like differently. Like maybe in another Kalpa they weren't dragons, but they were those same time souls. Like if you envision them as the dragon's soul, as a soul rather than the physical manifestation, because obviously, like we can see, a dragon's soul can be manifest in a human, or it can be manifest in an elf or a dragon, as we traditionally know them. So in the but
just a question: whose neck veins was Pelennor chomping on when he yelled out Riemann?
I think it's
Was it
Haramir of Copper and Tea. Yeah.
I wonder if there was any like, I don't know, knowledge absorption when he did that.
Maybe
From,
another
like, some big crazy
another thing to throw out there is that Alkosh, who is like the Khajiit version, he was credited with apparently sending away Pelennor when Pelennor was going massacring all the Khajiit because he thought they were elves. Right. Apparently it was Alkosh that stopped him, which kind of doesn't make as much sense if he's... it could be, look, you don't know, but yeah. But yeah, I guess we can also, like, if other people want more information on how they're connected to time, I mean, an easy one to talk about is dragon breaks. So the concept of dragons are associated with time. And the dragon they refer to is generally Akatosh, right? And then if Akatosh breaks, that's time is broken. So that's like what we had with the Warp in the West or the Middle Dawn. And essentially what it is where time is going linear, and then you have all of these different versions, and time breaks, and essentially you have, say, 8 or infinite versions of timelines that happen, and they're all happening simultaneously. They're contradictory because they're in separate timelines, but now time's broken. There is an out of lore idea that there's these essentially the female counterparts of dragons called Jills, which essentially are responsible for basically making sense of the dragon break and repairing all of these separate timelines and sort of consolidating it as much as they can, and then kind of stitching it back together into a linear timeline. It's still not going to make sense because obviously, like the Warp in the West and the Miracle of Peace, there's all of these simultaneous endings that happened at once, but it's not as nuts as it could be. So they kind of stitch it back together, and then you have a continuing thread.
So they're basically just the writers at Bethesda who had to try and figure out what to do with the dragon break. Maybe the head writer was Jill. I don't know.
Yeah.
Where the Jills.
But outside of that, that's functionally what a dragon break is, regardless of whether there's these female dragons called Jills behind it doing it.
This is Kirkbride stuff, right?
Yeah. There's lots of... Yeah. There's also things... You got to be careful sometimes, because sometimes it's not actually Kirkbride stuff, or he's mentioned it, but then it gets carried away with other things, and then the idea becomes popular. But obviously, it's all still fun discussion and so on. And
for sure. I also like this idea that Akatosh is not necessarily the one who created dragons. Like in Skyrim, they'll say, Akatosh is their father. But I feel like a lot of the time that might be because they're speaking to someone who knows, just generally speaking, the dragon god of time to be Akatosh. For example, if they were speaking to a Khajiit from elsewhere, perhaps they would say Alkosh. And I think in their language, they would just say Bormahu. I think it's father.
Yeah.
Sounds kind of funny. But basically, because you see this question where Akatosh is considered a kind of benevolent god of men, as a divine. And they say, why would Akatosh create these dragons who, according to Parthenax at least, have this kind of desire that is so hard to resist to dominate others? And I mean, you look at what happened with the dragon cults, and I know that was also in some ways largely the fault of the dragon priests, but, the dragons still, they're very domineering, Why would Akatosh create that if he's a champion? And I think the answer to that might be that Akatosh, in the sense that he is known today, didn't create dragons, especially if Akatosh was kind of thought up of with Alesia creating the divines. And dragons have been around forever. Yeah. And Akatosh is kind of this present time
so why I kind of
concept of the Akka thing.
Well, that's why I kind of think it's more useful, I think, to think of Akka as just sort of like a concept of time, a time god. And then if dragons are a derivative of time, but then Akatosh is sort of imprinted on them, this benevolent dragon. So it's not so much that... Because if you think about instead of trying to put a mortal morality imprinting that onto the god, or at least the concept as a whole, not the specific gods. But then if you think about it like that, like if you think of Akatosh, if you go with the madness idea that he's stuck in a loop, maybe he kind of wants to just get out of it. Maybe the dragons being sort of derivative of are sort of like dominating to kind of like dominating time, if that makes sense. They want to control because they've got these things like, I need to get a grip on time, and that's sort of how it sort of personifies in the world, if that makes sense.
Maybe. Another idea I've heard is Auriel created them. Auriel being, the first kind of Akka concept, and that Auriel hates men and then creates elves who just go and dominate exclusively men, and for whatever reason leave the elfish races of Tamriel alone.
I think one of the harder things with time is there's plenty instances of this that like it's in Elder Scrolls universe is inherently kind of, and they've fixed it in because for retcons and stuff, but it's inherently changing not just the future but the past also changes. Like concepts, so like like classic examples would be like potentially Ebenarm and Sai and stuff like that, them sort of being retconned, or the warp in the west. Like Talos was never a god until the warp in the west happened, and now retroactively he's been a god since his ascension back when he was emperor and first died and so on and ascended to the heavens, or when the jungle became grasslands or so on. But then that past is now true, but it's also true that it was once jungle in this other timeline, if that makes sense. You know what I mean? But because there's this whole concept of there's this linear time that they're trying to stitch up all the time, that those once pasts that got you to that point won't necessarily be the true pasts now, if that makes sense. So like Akatosh could equally have created them, because that is the mythical past now. I guess for viewers and so on,
we went from 0 to 100 real quick. Dragons have claws and fly and have magic, and then it's like...
But it might make you mad a bit, some people, but it's a very logical... Like, Elder Scrolls inherently is a world about... It's kind of like myth makes reality, and like that's kind of... And that power... It's very... fluid, and malleable. It's not... You got to stop thinking about it in this sort of idea of there is this strict linear time. You have evolution of fish to monkeys to people kind of thing, because it's different. There's so many, and throw in dragon breaks and things like the time wound and stuff. You have all of these. I mean, put it this way: Alduin was supposed to destroy the world, and he wasn't, and he didn't do it back in the Merethic era. And instead he decided to dominate men and create his own kingdom. He gets sent forward in time, which then creates the whole story of Skyrim. And all of those thousands of years of history happen in between then. But then, because of someone... what I'm saying is there's a lot of time bending in the Elder Scrolls. Like, there's a lot... Yeah.
Oh, I mean, and the idea that, you know, like the dragons were specifically there to kind of mess with men, it's like that could potentially make sense for a while, but then you've now got a storyline that goes back to the second era of the dragons active in elsewhere, and then it's like, oh wait, are the Khajiit a derivative of the elves, or are they their own beast race? It's kind of like, you know, with every new story that comes out, there's so many years of things that kind of get put in a new light that you can't really... Yeah, so we're all insane for even trying to comprehend it.
Yeah, absolutely. But you know, it's cool. I think it's part of the appeal of the Elder Scrolls. I just, while we're kind of on the topic of Alduin, there was a question from Sachin Dash asking about the future for dragons after Alduin's defeat. If you guys have any thoughts about it, because yeah, Alduin, like I could just lead on that Alduin, you don't absorb his soul. You defeat him, but yeah, now there's dragons everywhere. So what do you guys think?
It's funny. I was going to say, could you ask the actual question? And then I found it, and it literally just says, future for dragons after Alduin's defeat, ...
Yeah.
Well, I feel like they're going to be dealt with in Skyrim for some time, but it seems like despite everything that's been going on, what's happening in Akavir seems to just be like, we don't care what's going on in Tamriel. Like, our own stuff's happening over here. Over here. And so I think that's going to go ahead as normal, even with, you know, all of the stuff going on in Skyrim. And I still think that, you know, eventually they're going to come over.
The Akaviri.
Eventually, you know, we won't go there, but they'll come here. Yeah.
Yeah, I think so. Because that's always a potential plot line they've got. I feel like they're going to have to up the ante after Elder Scrolls 6, you know, in 2050 when they come out with Elder Scrolls 7.
Oh, yeah.
You know?
But yeah, so in terms of the Skyrim dragons, right?
Yeah.
Like what's going on? Look, I don't think that dragons will be like a massive, and this is just from a writing perspective, a massive focus in the Elder Scrolls 6. As much as Bethesda loves dragons and they're putting them in everything, I wouldn't be surprised if you find a dragon in some ruin in Hammerfell, or there's a dragon or two in the game. But I feel like you might just have it explained away, like the Dragonborn does something, or I don't know. I don't think there's going to be permanently a heavy dragon presence in Tamriel.
I also personally get the vibe from the lore perspective, I don't think there's as many dragons in Skyrim as there are in the game. So, for example, like, you know how there's the named dragon at the start, and there's a few other little named dragons, and you can imagine like a bunch, or maybe some of the word walls, like one at each of the word walls kind of thing. But you know how it becomes a generic enemy type that could just pop up all the time? You might have killed 300 dragons in your big playthrough of... I just get the feeling that, you know, obviously that's a gameplay mechanic. There's not that many around, especially if you take dragons to be more powerful than they're sort of presented to be. Like, if they are these crazy powerful beings that can use the thumb to bend
and
reality.
big as well.
Yeah, if you have all of that, it's just there's way too many.
I think it would be safe to say just the named ones, you know, like Alduin's proper homies, and they're the ones who are around.
Yeah. So, and the rest is just sort of down to...
Actually, that is something that I wanted to ask you to see what your take is. What do you think is the deal with some dragons being, I guess, seemingly more intelligent than others, whereas others are just like these kind of base, super, like permanently hostile aggro dragons that just don't speak? I'm sure it's just a game mechanic thing, but some just seem to be much more advanced and different to others, even though they've all been immortal. And it could be explained by the Dragon Souls thing.
Yeah, well, I guess, I was just about to say, like, we could have potentially answered it with the discussion we were having, in that the more powerful ones are the ones who happen to be the most intelligent, and maybe these ones who don't seem too intelligent are just the scrubs who never win fights and never absorb other dragon souls.
Yeah, it could be.
Yeah, perhaps, yeah. I guess some people also, like Lotad is hungry. He said, when did the Nords learn to combat the dragons via dragon shouts? And it goes on to talk about kind and so on, but essentially he's kind of asking about that whole interaction. And that basically, Yeah, so there's either Kine or Kine through Parthenax or whatever. It would have been in the Merethic era during the Dragon Wars, which at the minimum, they have to be before 1,000 to 800 years before the First Era. But like I did some math and stuff with the Isgramor dynasty and stuff like that, and with Harold being the 13th in line, and roughly, I think I put in some other video that Isgramor would have arrived around 500-ish years before the start of the First Era. So at some point in between then and the start of the First Era, the Dragon Wars happen. Maybe like 50 to 100 years into Isgramor's reign, or his descendants or something. But it neatly happens in that period somewhere. So you've got the whole rise of the dragon cult. You've got the whole rise of the dragon priests and stuff. Presumably then is when, I guess, the shouts and thumb kind of powers are being taught to the dragon priests exclusively. But then, obviously, when Parthenax disagrees with Alduin, he sort of goes his own way and actually teaches men, maybe at the behest of Kine, or like that's how, maybe, I don't know, something like that. And then he taught the men how to use the thumb to help fight back against the dragons and the tyranny of the dragon priests and stuff like that.
Yeah, I mean, and that's the thing. We don't actually know how involved Kine really was. Because, correct me if I'm wrong, but is Kine's involvement referenced on the tablets for when you're going up to High Hrothgar, and there's the different like etched tablets that talk about the history and stuff? One of them talks about the dragons ruling over all of Mundus, which I think is a massive exaggeration. And I think if another one were to say, oh yeah, Kine taught them this, it could also just be a bit of a Nordic kind of take
Definitely
on what happened and not what actually happened.
The only reason... Sorry, go on.
Oh, no, I was just going to say, I feel like you could make a stronger claim that it's got something to do with Akatosh more so than Kynareth, but they just, obviously the Nords love Kine.
But Akatosh as a concept wasn't necessarily like even a thing. If you're looking at it in a linear sense, wasn't as much of a thing at that point because it's 200 years. The reason I'd say the Kine, so like Kine creating the humans and so on, and sort of being a figure that's mercy on men and so on, that Kine could have been the person to sort of talk to Parthenax and persuade him of this sort of like other way, this peaceful, high in the sky kind of way, and that he should help the humans and so on. Like, I don't look, there's, lots of things said in the Elder Scrolls. I see no reason to discount the idea that, and also the thing was too, is that Kine was always, beforehand was the one who taught them the thumb in the lore. Then they insert the Parthenax kind of thing comes Skyrim.
I found the exact quote actually from the etched tablet.
Yeah.
So it says, Kine called on Parthenax, who pitied man. Together they taught men to use the voice. Then dragon war raged, dragon against tongue. Men prevailed, shouting Alduin out of the world, proving for all that their voice too was strong, although their sacrifices were manifold. So Kine called on Parthenax, who pitied man. It almost, in this description at least, sounds like Parthenax already pitied man. Kine kind of scoped Parthenax out as, good potential for being a helpful dragon.
Yeah.
To what Kine wanted for men, and then
I just think there's no reason to disbelieve that. There's no like...
No, they just tend to exaggerate when you look at the other things they say about the same story.
Well, while we're on this topic, one thing I absolutely love is in Old Norse mythology, there's the story of Sigurd slaying the dragon Fafnir, and after he kills him, Odin comes to him and says to drink Fafnir's blood, and when he does, he's given the ability to understand the language of the birds. Which, it's semi-related, but it seems like a cool inspiration for the idea.
And Kine being the hawk and stuff, and like...
Yeah.
And being associated with wind, sky, and, that kind of thing. It's kind of like a nice little connection between the dragons and stuff. It's cool. Have you... I completely off topic, but I remember there's a movie called The One Ring or something, which is that story. It's like a little mini series made into a movie or so on, where he like bathes in the dragon's blood, but he becomes immortal. But except there was a leaf on part of his back, and that becomes his one vulnerable spot. He's like this immortal.
Oh, that's cool.
Yeah, no, I don't know if that. I hope that's not just a movie thing, but it's at least based on that whole story and goes, But Yeah, back to the Elder Scrolls.
That story almost reminds me of the Boethia one with Fearstruck and Lyrisius, and the one scale that was tarnished on the dragon's back that it couldn't reach. That Lyrisius said that he would polish and then stabbed the dragon instead.
Yeah. But yeah, so I guess everyone by now should have a pretty firm understanding of dragons themselves and their ideas of them being connected to time.
Well, let's talk about the dragon cult. So obviously the origins of the dragon cult are kind of based on these traditions of animal worship, supposedly brought over by the Atmorans to Tamriel, and they had all the different animals, and at the top was the dragon. So as they were worshipping dragons, eventually the dragons installed kind of leaders, dragon priests, to rule over the men, simply because the dragons were not interested in the kind of base politics and the menial tasks.
The governance.
They read the governance. They read the 4-Hour Work Week by Tim Ferriss, and they were like, nah, outsource.
Yeah.
So they got dragon priests, and they gave the dragon priests some powers so that they could honestly assert power over the men and, make sure that there was tribute to the dragons and so on. But the dragon priests eventually became very, very greedy, which tends to happen when you give people too much power, and demanded more and more and more of the people. And according to that text, as I said earlier in the video, were different to how they were on Atmora, and really ruled with an iron fist and made slaves out of everyone.
Yeah. I wonder what actually started that whole thing, where maybe the dragon cult sort of started off both in Atmora and then originally in Skyrim as sort of a kind of a more respectful relationship, not so much like they give them their due reverence, but they're not the same sort of dominate, I'm your ultimate ruler kind of thing. And maybe Alduin hadn't sort of turned away from his purpose yet at that point. And then when he turns towards the sort of, dominate, that's it, I'm not going to end the timeline, I'm going to dominate all of Mundus and try and, do that mortal realm. That's when at Skyrim he started domineering, and the god priests kind of changed, you know what I mean, and became a bit more.
Well, it makes sense when you consider the fact that humans in Atmora had, their kings, and they seemed relatively prosperous. It's not like they were, constantly at existential risk of being destroyed by the dragons. That definitely seems like something that kind of evolved more as you came over to Skyrim.
Well, how about the Skull? The Skull have been living the same lifestyle for a very long time. And wouldn't they have been under rule by dragons?
Well, I guess they were. I actually can't remember exactly when the Skull got in there, because we do know that obviously Mirak and the 3 other priests were there on the island. But
because the Skull were involved with the dragon cult. They're descended from the Nords who served the dragon cult on Solstheim.
Yeah, so that's all after this, though.
Yeah.
Because you have the Snow Elves and stuff were there, and there was the Battle of the Mose Ring. Snow Elf Prince dies. Then obviously you'd have the dragon cult get established, and then you had the point where you had Mirak, and according to it's kind of like not super, super strict canon, but those 3 other priests with their sort of Lovecraftian masks were also swayed to the side of Mirak. But then, and then they were locked up by Valok, the jailer. In a big battle. And apparently that's the battle that separated Solstheim from the mainland of Skyrim in this big, cataclysmic battle.
Which means that Valok the jailer must have been immensely powerful.
Yeah. And then their descendants, I guess would have been the Skull and so on. But the Skull, then, they're a later sort of deal. I'm not sure how much directly they are actually completely representative of Atmor and religion. Because as much as they have the totem elements and stuff, they do sort of have a real all-maker focus. It's a little bit different. And, let's not forget that the totems aren't just like, I'm worshipping like a fox. They're all representative of an actual Adric entity. Like all of them have an associate, like the owl being Junal, Kine, Hawk, Shaw, the fox. Like they all have an equivalent. So it's not whether they were called those names right back then in the Merethic era necessarily, but I mean, I don't know why not. I guess like I don't think it was some like caveman kind of animal totem thing at the time of Skyrim. Maybe it was even at Mora way before then, but I mean, they I forget the name of it's like Ecofrick or something, some big like name of it Mora. Apparently it's this enormous shipyard and stuff. Like you got to remember they weren't primitive. They were making like entire fleets that they can send to Atmora. So the Atmorans themselves weren't these primitive types or anything.
Oh, absolutely. I've also heard, back to Valok, I've heard that he is rumored to be the most powerful dragon priest of all of them. And he doesn't have a mask associated with him, and people assume that's because his mask was actually Konorik.
Okay.
Like the super powerful mask, which just means warlord. Like there's an idea that the mask was temporary and given to whoever the strongest dragon priest was, and that's why he doesn't have a mask, and would also explain his ability to get rid of Mirak.
Yeah. Yeah.
Well, and I feel like Mirak would have gotten a lot stronger once he was adopted by Hermaeus Mora as well. Would you say?
Although I think he learning from Mora before he got plucked to the realm still, or he hadn't at all?
I think he was learning from...
I think he was learning bits, but obviously he didn't have all the juicy stuff
there is the whole,
from Apocrypha.
There's the whole theory too that he... Which I think we talked about in the Mirak Explained video, that he actually became became Dragonborn through his interactions with Hermaeus Mora, because Hermaeus Mora, having like all infinite knowledge, would have potentially knowledge of everything, or how he could have knowledge of the same blessing that Akatosh would bestow upon Alicia and her descendants and so on. So maybe it wasn't as much as I'm directly blessed by Akatosh, but instead in a pact with Hermaeus Mora, I'm going to get an actual dragon soul, which obviously he would have idolized to at least some degree because of all of the other dragons.
For sure.
So he's like, yes, ultimate power. Now I can actually kill the other dragons. I think Mirak also talks a fair amount of shit when he's like, I could have killed Alduin, I could have done this, and it's like,
and it's like, mate, Valok the jailer was too much trouble for you.
Yeah. But yeah, there's plenty of colorful characters in the Dragon Priests, and like I guess people are sort of asking, they kind of changed the lore a little bit, but like we in regards to the Draga, but the Draga, as they are in the current incarnation of the lore, are basically the eternal servants of the Dragon Priests, and that's kind of how their like soul energy or whatever, or life force, is what they constantly sustain the Dragon Priest, who are essentially liches, just not in the exact same way as other liches. But yeah, and then they're all committed to Alduin's return, because remember, Alduin got sent forward in the future, and I'm sure they'd be aware of this. Like, and they used the Elder Scroll to send him forward, so they probably are all preparing for his great return in the events of Skyrim. But I'll go through some extra questions. Real X Steel said, could dragons use all types of magic? And yes, we think so too. And like even Durnavir was capable of summoning Bone Men and Wraithmen. But
I feel like that if I was a dragon, though, the incentive to learn the type of magic that mortals are using is quite low. I mean, you look at some of the Master Illusion spells and compare it to potentially what you could do with Bend Will or things like that. I mean, you can just shout, rip someone's soul out, have them fight for you. You can even use Whirlwind Sprint. Like, imagine a dragon just going whoosh, like hyper speed across the sky. Like, there's so many things they can do with the thumb and with their language, which is magical enough. And I'm sure there's dragon shouts that you don't even know of in Skyrim that like fill in the gaps of other cool things you could think of.
Yeah. I mean, I think we've had this conversation before, but we're sort of talking about how if in terms of game mechanics, they make dragon shout competitions and fights basically seem like, oh, it's like a verbal debate. and so on. But if you actually think about it, like that's obviously they're just breathing fire and frost and maybe the occasional like little soul blast thing or something because it's a game mechanic and you want to have like, elemental damage and things to actually like understand and fight. Whereas there's nothing stopping those debates between like kind of being a little bit more literal. If you imagine these sort of dragons and they're like debating each other in kind of like, speaking all these different, dragon language words you don't understand, but they're sort of like combating mythologies and stuff, which is sort of formulating the fabric of the universe. Because remember, the Thum is like a inherently like universe bending magic. It's not sorcery magica and so on, so it's changing the rules. So imagine if there's these two dragons, they're kind of like seeing whose philosophy is greater, and you know what I mean.
They're like trying to outwheel each other, as opposed to the idea of them flying around and one of them goes fire and fire comes out, and another one goes frost and frost comes out, and then some mortal sitting in Skyrim goes, haha, it's just like a verbal debate, like
So it's
I don't know.
So
it
like,
just doesn't hold up to me.
So it's like a bit it's like a myth makes reality kind of thing. They by their whole idea that how they were saying that power makes right. If they're the strongest with their voice, then they can make this certain in the universe versus the other persons, and then assert their power. So it's kind of like rather than just the physical manifestation, like you just said, it could be a bit more of a philosophical thing, Yeah.
What other questions do we have?
There was Lupus Alpha was saying, why didn't dragons have as much of a presence in Tamriel outside of Skyrim and elsewhere? And we can kind of drop it. We've kind of talked about that a little bit, but it would be useful to expand on, I guess, the Dragon Wars and stuff. But in my personal opinion, I think that the whole Dragon Wars fiasco was very short-lived in Skyrim. I feel like when Isgramor came over, the dragon cult might have been sort of becoming a bit of a thing back in Atmora. Kind of gets established. Isgramor sets up his whole shtick in Skyrim, kills all the snow elves, stuff like that. Then maybe his son or something becomes king, and the dragon cult's really getting popularity. Then it sort of comes out and catches on in Skyrim. In Skyrim, it really starts proliferating, and it's really good for a little bit. But then maybe Alduin has a change of heart, wants to dominate, the priests come in, and that lasts. But maybe that tyranny only lasts for like 50 years or even less. And then it all gets, fixed when Paarthurnax teaches them. Like, what I'm saying is all the whole Dragon Wars, Dragon Cult conflict could easily be within a tidy 100 years.
I mean, you'd almost hope so, because otherwise it just kind of, you start questioning, why isn't the influence here? Why isn't the influence there? Why have we never heard about it? Obviously, because they just wrote it for Skyrim after writing all this other lore.
But it does make sense, because the other thing that's like, if you do, there's two things. If you propose that it was there for a long, long time, like longer than inside of 100 years, I'd even say less potentially. It's like, well, then why didn't they conquer all of Tamriel? The dragons are crazy powerful. The dragon priests are crazy powerful. How couldn't they just spread further and get a lot further? It's like, well, maybe they actually didn't have as much time as you think. And also another thing to consider is that it seems we only knew of like one dragon priest of each area, sort of like there was only one dragon priest ruler of this ruin or city or whatever back then, or this city. So because maybe there was only like one generation of dragon priests. And if you look at Azadal was he was like one of the first in contact with elves or something, wasn't it? And he learned enchanting from the elves, and he came back and like it kind of almost sometimes I from what memory, someone look it up, but I'm pretty sure it's kind of the vibes that he left and learned enchanting from the elves and then sort of came back, and then the dragon cult's almost a thing there, and it doesn't seem like there's this big domineering dragon cult in his childhood.
I'll actually give you a hot take that I just thought of.
Yeah.
Maybe the reason the dragons didn't spread all over Tamriel is because it's a lot easier to dominate a group of men who already believe and worship animals with dragons at the top. Do you know what I mean? Like they're ready to worship dragons.
Yeah.
You go down to some elvish place, they're not really ready to worship dragons, and maybe they've got powerful Daedra or Aedra helping them do things. You know what I mean? Like it seems like it's not that they couldn't. It's not that they couldn't, but you wouldn't necessarily have the same genuine servitude. Like you would have a lot more philosophical and mental resistance to, hey, we're dragons, worship us.
Yeah.
As opposed to a race of people who already worship animals.
Yeah. I still feel like they just have just so much power that they could just...
They could, but it would be a different dynamic, I guess, is what I'm saying.
Yeah.
It would be a very like just we control you because of force and no other reason than that.
Yeah. My ultimate conclusion would be that I just think it was short-lived, the whole Cold Dragon Wars thing. I think that's a pretty tidy explanation. Explains why there aren't hundreds of dragon priests and instead there's only like a generation, maybe two, of dragon priests. And that there aren't, because there's not heaps and heaps of masks and so on. And
what do you think, Drew?
Yeah, I mean, like, you wonder, did they just have no interest in, like, a huge expansion? Because I feel like they really could have done it. I mean, like, you know, for example, when you actually look at the few dragons who were active outside of Skyrim, you know, one of them being Nefala Largus, who was involved in the like Stros Mackay, the civil war that was going on there. There was like a naval battle with the force of the Red Guards. I can't remember if it's the Crowns or the Forebears now. I get those two mixed up a lot.
The Crowns.
Crowns, right. Yeah, against the Imperial fleet. And Nefala Largus just comes along and absolutely messes up the Crowns. And it's like, they really could have done a lot more. So the idea that there was a time restraint makes a lot of sense. That, or they just didn't particularly feel the need to spread across the entirety of Tamriel.
Interestingly, too, they do have limited spread into High Rock as well. That like, so it's almost like the intention was there. I think it's a Zarn.
A little bit Stormhaven, right?
Stormhaven
being the location. I just remember, if I look at Stormhaven, give me one moment. I believe there was a dragon thing there.
And while you're getting that up, just like looking at things like the Dragon Tail Mountains as well, you could just say it, but it makes sense that they'd kind of like, you know, be active in these regions.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely.
I can't actually find it, but I just feel like I remember some kind of dungeon involving a ancient dragon thing.
There is this whole Zarn the Scale Caller who served the dragon Thurvoken. Left central Skyrim for a remote mountain called Scale Caller Peak, and I'm pretty sure it was towards High Rock direction, but it wasn't in Skyrim. But basically what I'm saying, that's why I feel like it was a short-lived thing, and because they were sort of on the path for expansion, they were spreading, but it was just too short-lived to get anything solid done.
And you know, you've got a dragon who lived in Daggerfall. You got Skakmat, who was involved in the battle at Kringane Field, dropping the mist over the battlefield. But you know, so that's pretty far-reaching. But once again, it's only one dragon. It's very far ahead in time.
I found the page I was looking for. So Scale Caller Peak, you were talking about, yeah, is a group dungeon located in Stormhaven. Yeah, part of the Dragon Bones Dungeon Pack DLC, along with Fang Lair. So there you go.
Yeah. Also, actually, to throw out there, here's an interesting thing for timescale is Azadal is born in Sarthal in the late Merethic era, and basically he went and sought out elven teachers, but then when he came back, he found his home burnt to the ground by elves. So he was actually, like, before the return, so when Isgramor came back, he was alive at that time and so on. So maybe it only happened like even in Isgramor's lifespan. Maybe Alduin got really cocky and sort of, I'm going to dominate everything and so on after Isgramor's death or something. And that was kind of that instituted the change. Because, you know, Isgramor already had fully grown adult sons by the time of the return. So it's not like he was a young guy. So yeah, maybe it pretty much happened straight after that, and then that was short-lived, and then gets back to normal.
And I mean, rather than them getting kicked out by the cliff racers, you know, it's like, like perhaps they just didn't have time or, you know, the resources to expand enough before they, you know, were dealing with stuff on the home front.
I don't think they necessarily would have been in Morrowind, because at this same time, the Chimer and Dwemer should be in Morrowind as well, and I feel like they should say something about there being dragons.
Yeah, exactly. I was going to say that. Like, why is there no reference to dragons from any of those races in their ancient texts.
Yeah.
I mean, surely the Dwemer would want to learn about their magics and things like that, especially regarding universe-changing things and, their love of tonal architecture. And
Yeah.
I mean,
And
maybe that's how they learned it.
if they were, it would have been like Falofi Mountains. It was like as the furthest.
Yeah.
One extra time reference. Another thing was, for how I was saying about trying to place when Ysgramor's return was in the Merethic era. It's Codlac Whitemane says that the companions are nearly 5,000 years old, which would place it at sometime in the last 5 centuries in the Merethic era. So that was another time supporting thing. So yeah. But I'll keep going. Just check. We've got some more questions. And there is also, speaking of Ysgramor, from Year Semi, did Ysgramor bring the dragons with him when he returned? But later on, when the dragon cult was overthrown, the story was changed to reclaim their national hero. It might explain why the Falmer were pushovers for a few companions. There are some people that go on ideas about the dragons coming with him and helping him, or being even members of the companions.
I was gonna say there's even theories that say Ysgramor is a dragon.
Yeah,
like there's some really, really, really out there stuff in terms of Ysgramor dragons and the companions coming.
How does he wield Wuthrad then?
I don't know. He's a shapeshifter, maybe.
Yeah, I feel like it's
he wields Wuthrad in his mouth and flies around and slashes.
This is I feel like this is a bit of a meme.
It'd be hard to hide that in the history.
Yeah.
I think.
Yeah.
He could have come over with dragons, but honestly, I find it kind of, from a narrative perspective, I think it undermines Ysgramor that like everything's a dragon, everything and anything ever great accomplished had to be because a dragon was there, and it's like,
for sure. And I think it also comes from this idea that you see a lot, that elves are somehow so strong and so superior, and that how could men possibly bring an army and slaughter a bunch of elves? It's like they're not living gods. They may have some advantages, but they can absolutely be slaughtered by a angry pack of Nords who've been training to kill things their whole life.
Absolutely. Lulivia was saying, I definitely want to hear speculation about dragons in Morrowind, or lack thereof, and also mentioned the run out by cliff races thing. But yeah, like we kind of said, like I kind of meant, like they could maybe be annoyed by pests and leave, but I don't think they're there because the Chimera and Dwemer don't mention anything about them being there. I don't know.
Yeah.
They've got Skyrim right next door with a bunch of worshippers and so on that are happy to, do anything for them. Well, not happy to. It depends. The priests were, but yeah. Here's an interesting take. From Bradley Gray. I presume it's canon that Parthenax was slain, correct? If so, with Alduin and Parthenax dead, what's the future of the winged beasts in Tamriel? Do you believe they'll play a role in the Empire and Aldmeri Dominion conflicts?
Well, I don't think it is canon
that
Parthenax was slain, to be honest. I don't know why. It could be, but I don't know. What do you think that assumption could be based off?
Maybe just because it is a quest that appears during the main storyline, but I just feel like they won't give you a canon decision. I feel like it's just they're not going to address it at all. And killing Parthenax is it's a unanimously hated decision. Like, there's very few people that are like, yeah, Parthenax deserves to die. It's a bit of he's such a, you know what I mean? Like a liked character.
I think they'll leave it like open-ended, so there's always the chance they can call on him again if they ever want him in the narrative.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, why burn your bridges if you don't have to? And plus, the whole fan base loves him, so...
We did address, too, what's the future of the winged beasts a bit. Like, we thought, like...
Yeah.
They're just gonna... There'll be a few floating around. I think they'll probably go into hiding and stuff. I don't think they're going to be fundamental story elements anymore. Do you think they'll play a role with the Empire and Aldmeri Dominion conflicts? I don't think so. They always could.
I can see a little thing, like 1 or 2 dragons being involved in a storyline, because, you know what, I'm being honest, I actually do think we will see at least 1 dragon in Elder Scrolls 6. I really do. Whether it's just deep in some ruin or in one quest, I think they're going to have a dragon. I just don't think it will dominate the game like it did with Skyrim. But I would be very surprised for there to be 0 dragons in Elder Scrolls 6, especially after them shoehorning it into Elder Scrolls Online DLC. It's in other... I'm pretty sure it's even in Blades. Like...
It'll have a lot more impact too if you only do meet one. Like the classic sort of like dragon in his cave with his hoard of gold kind of thing. If you kind of came across a dragon like that, it'd be interesting. But... I don't know if we want to discuss this anymore about the concept of their desire to dominate and sort of like what they mean. I also think I don't like that from a writing perspective. I think dragons are interested enough without this innate ability to dominate, because I don't get what the end goal of that is, and even in regards to if you're connecting it back to Ak or Akatosh and all the derivatives and whatnot, like. What purpose does it sort of serve to dominate? Unless, actually, here, if it's if you consider that Akatosh and Oriel and all that are sort of very Anuic and very anti-Lorcan and so on, if they see the Nords and all of the humans and stuff as these sort of Patamaic pro-Lorcan, or Shor as they call him, sort of elements that dominating them is sort of like... suppressing them and like, do you know what I mean? Perhaps.
Yeah, that's kind of what I was saying with the idea before, that perhaps Oriel created the dragons, or the part of Akka representing the beginning.
Yeah.
That dragons have supposedly always been around from.
And you could
created them.
You could also kind of say that it's more of a description of Alduin rather than all the dragons, you know, because Alduin is innately going to be very greedy. You know, he wants to consume the world. And you can imagine that a lot of dragons are just following their leader rather than all inherently wanting to dominate and destroy everything.
Well, there is the thing where Parthenax says...
that's the thing, he says it.
He says it's an innate thing. And then he says, like... Because there's a little philosophical thing where it's like, oh, what's better, to be born good or to overcome your evil nature and be good, basically. Paraphrase there, but yeah.
I'm pretty sure Mewtwo says that as well.
Oh, there we go. Skyrim just jacked it from the Pokemon movie, dude.
Yeah. Yeah, no, true.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I don't know. I don't think that the writing is that great in terms of just dominate everything. I definitely would rather the dragons, like more examples of Parthenax type dragons who are like, you know, different.
I feel like the seeking power angle can be done without the domination angle, because you have the ones go to...
Maybe it's semantics. Maybe it just means they crave power and they dominate each other and they have their debates and fight over who's right and wrong. And potentially, if you go into those deeper theories, like you said before, they're kind of bending reality and whose versions of things are, you know, the right one, essentially.
Yeah.
And having these conflicts and stuff. It could be that. It doesn't necessarily mean they... Like, for example, okay, men, what about animals or creatures? Do they want to dominate trolls? Do they want to dominate imps?
Yeah.
Like, where does it start and end? You know what I mean?
Yeah. Maybe only things that they think could contest them, potentially.
Yeah, so it could just be a basic power thing, not necessarily a dominate for the sake of pure dominance, like Molag Bau type thing.
I want to throw out an extra note about the Thum in general, and how, you know, the dragons, they use the debate, and it's that are likened to a debate, and that, you know, they're using stronger arguments, or whoever wins the debate / battle is right and correct. It's actually how Jurgen Windcaller, the guy who founded the Greybeards, he basically fought all of these other tongues who challenged his newfound philosophy of where you should only use it in reverence of the Thum, in reverence of the gods. And he does this. He asserts his philosophical dominance by beating them all in battle and swallowing all their shouts and stuff. So in the same way that the dragons kind of battle, like the actual physical battle is kind of like might makes right. It's like, you know, whoever's philosophy is strongest. It's the same thing to them. So, you know, Jurgen Windcaller was the strongest philosophically, and that's why he could win. Because I think, at least I believe, that they would interpret it in a very literal way, in that if you are stronger, your philosophy was correct, kind of thing. Like, that is the greater myth or position or whatever. Like, versus not just, oh, well, you just beat me with a hammer, but I'm still right. Like, they kind of, I think the other dragon or the other tongue or whatever would concede to the greater philosophy because they were beaten, if that makes sense.
Yeah, for sure. Is there anything else to say? I guess the last piece of information in my head would probably just be about their language, and how there's this idea that they write it obviously with their claws, and they have this like vestigial digit that they use to like push in the little dot things. Yeah. But then as you said to me off camera, how the greybeards will breathe the words for you to learn kind of onto the floor.
Yeah.
And then there's the idea that dragons could just write by going put and just spitting it on the wall, basically.
Yeah.
As opposed to using their claws, especially into stone. It's not to say that their claws couldn't do that, but
yeah, absolutely. But yeah, I think that's it. Some people also asked about Peryite taking form of the dragon, and some people, I don't know. I don't think there's anything to it, really. I think he's just...
I agree with the premise that it's just a primordial jest type thing, or he just likes dragons, or I just don't think it's a actual Akatosh related
it's
thing.
It's not indicative of Peryite's power or anything. It's not like and, you know, I don't think...
No, it's just a form that he's chosen to take, I think.
Yeah.
But who knows?
Who knows? But yeah, I think that's it. Drew, any closing notes? Do you have anything?
Dragons are cool, man. I like dragons.
All right. Well, thank you very much, everyone, for watching. Social media links are in the description below. Let us know what you think and tell us what you want to see on the podcast next. We're always keen to hear some new and interesting topics. My name is Michael. This has been FudgeMuppet with Scott and Drew, and I look forward to nerding out with you all again very soon.